Beleriand. This is the fashion of the lands into which the Noldor came, in the north of the western regions of Middle-earth, in the ancient days. Hithlum, the land of mist. It was a fair land, although its air was cool and winter there was cold. Fingolfin's folk dwelt in Mithrim, about the shores of the Great Lake. Tuor came down from the tall hills of Mithrim and passed out into the northward plain of Dor-Lómin. He could descry in the west the long grey ridges of Ered Lómin, fencing off the far coastlands of the western shores. Tuor found before him a wall of rock, and there was an opening therein like a great arch, and the stream passed in and was lost. Then Tuor followed down the steps and waded in the cold water, until he passed into the shadow beyond the arch of stone. The river began to go suddenly down a smooth slope into a great tunnel, leading on and downward into a deep gloom. When he had come to the foot of the rapids, they stood under a great dome of rock, and there the river rushed over a steep fall with a great noise that echoed in the vault. And it passed then on again beneath another arch into a further tunnel. He saw far before him a light, and hastening on he came to a tall and narrow cleft, and followed the noisy stream between its leaning walls out into a golden evening, for he was come to a deep ravine with tall sheer sides, and before him the setting sun, going down through a clear sky, shone into the ravine, and kindled its walls with yellow fire, and the waters of the river glittered like gold as they broke and foamed upon many gleaming stones. And where the water foamed among the boulders or rushed over sudden falls, at morning and evening rainbows were woven across the stream. The channel grew wider, and its walls lower and less sheer, but the river ran deeper and more strongly, for high hills now marched on either side, and fresh waters spilled from them into Cirith Ninjach over shimmering falls. The sides of the ravine drew together again, and he came to a narrow channel. A wild flood came up the narrows and strove with the river, and a wave like a wall rose up almost to the cliff top. But now Tuor was dismayed by the fury of the strange waters, and he went away southward, and so came not to the long shores of the firth of Drengist. Tuor passed into the borders of Nevrast, and at last at unawares, for the cliff tops at the margin of the land were higher than the slopes behind, he came suddenly to the black brink of Middle-earth, and saw the great sea, Belegaer the shoreless. Nevrast was a milder land, watered by the wet winds from the sea and sheltered from the cold north winds that blew over Hithlum. It was a hollow land, surrounded by mountains and great coast cliffs higher than the plains behind. And there was a great mere in the midst of Nevrast, with no certain shores, being encircled by wide marshes. A multitude of birds dwelt there, of such as love tall reeds and shallow pools. Among the tall and sea-hewn cliffs were many coves and sheltered inlets, with beaches of white sand among the black gleaming rocks. As he went south, the great cliffs became lower, and their tops were clothed deep with flowering turf. He saw a line of great hills, marching westward until they ended in a tall mountain. A dark and cloud-helmed tower reared upon mighty shoulders above a great green cape thrust out into the sea. The mountain was Mount Taras, and beneath its long slopes, Vinyamar. The havens of Brithombar and Eglarest were built anew. Behind their great walls they became fair towns and harbors with quays and piers of stone. Eärendil built Vingilot, fairest of the ships of song. Golden were its oars and white its timbers, hewn in the birch woods of Nimbrethil. Many fair pearls were got in great number in the shallow waters about the Isle of Balar. And beyond lay the marshes and isles of reed about the mouths of Sirion, and the sands of his delta empty of all living things save birds of the sea. In the willow meads of Tassarinan I walked in the spring. Ah, the sight and the smell of the spring in Nan Tassarion. South of Nan Tathren was a region of meads filled with many flowers. Narog came through these hills in a deep gorge and flowed over rapids but had no fall, and on its western bank the land rose into the great wooded highlands of Tauren Faroth. On the west side of this gorge, where the short and foaming stream Ringwil tumbled headlong into Narog, Finrod established Nargothrond. Fingolfin, king of the Noldor, made a great feast, and it was held in the spring near to the pools of Ivrin, whence the swift river Narog rose, for there the lands were green and fair at the feet of the mountains of shadow that shielded them from the north. On Ivrin's lake is endless laughter. She is fed from crystal fountains unfailing. The fair pool of Ivrin had lain in its great stone basin carved by falling waters, and all about it had been a tree-clad hollow under the hills. Ered Wethrin, the north fence of Beleriand. The dark eaves of Ered Wethrin. Ered Wethrin was a wall insurmountable. There was a narrow vale, whose sheer walls were clad with pines, but the vale itself was green, for the river Sirion flowed through it. Finrod held the pass of Sirion, and upon the isle of Tol Sirion, in the midst of the river, he built a mighty watchtower. A darkling well, where Rivil rises from the fell, down into Serech's reeds to flow. The mighty river Sirion rose at Eithel Sirion. The grass of Ardgallen was rich and green. Morgoth sent forth great rivers of flame that ran down and poured over all the plain. Thus Ardgallen perished, and it became a burned and desolate waste, full of a choking dust, barren and lifeless, and it was called Anfauglith. A great mound in the midst of Anfauglith was like a hill that could be seen from afar, Hauðenindengin, the hill of slain. But grass came there, and grew again long and green upon that hill, alone in all the desert that Morgoth made. In the north of the world, Melkor had in the ages past reared Ered Engrin, and they stood upon the borders of the regions of everlasting cold. He took up his abode in the endless dungeons of Angband, the hells of iron. Beneath Ered Engrin he made a great tunnel, and there he made a mighty gate. But above this gate he piled the thunderous towers of Thangorodrim. They were black and desolate and exceedingly lofty, and smoke issued from their tops, dark and foul upon the northern sky. South of Ardgalen, the great highland named Dor-Lómin stretched for 60 leagues from west to east. Great pine forests it bore. By gentle slopes from the plain it rose to a bleak and lofty land, where lay many tarns at the feet of bare tors. To the pine trees upon the highland of Dor-Lómin I climbed in the winter. Ah, the wind and the whiteness and the black branches of winter upon Orodnathon. In the east of those highlands there lay a lake, Tarn Eiluin, with wild heaths about it. The waters were held in reverence, for they were clear and blue by day, and by night were a mirror for the stars. Anach lies above the high springs of Mindeb, a hard and dangerous road. The sheer precipices of Ered Gorgoroth, the mountains of terror, fell down from high Dor-Lómin, and beneath their feet were shadows that were laid before the rising of the moon. There life and light were strangled, and there all waters were poisoned. Beyond lay the wilderness of Dungortheb. There spiders abode, and monsters wandered there, and that region was filled with fear. And the thin waters that spilled from Ered Gorgoroth were defiled, and perilous to drink, for the hearts of those that tasted them were filled with shadows of madness and despair. All living things else shunned that land. The first glimmer of day filtered gray amid the mists of Dimbar, the empty land of Dimbar. All the land was cold and desolate. Many miles they toiled on in the stones of the dry river, and the evening brought darkness into the deep cleft. Its course turned eastward, winding up to the very walls of the mountains. The silent cliffs of the Echoriath, the sheer walls of the Chrysaegrim, abode of eagles. They towered up, for their sides were like sheer walls, piled each one above and behind the lower, as were they great towers of many-storied precipices. Turgon found, and so came to the green plain amid the mountains, and saw the island hill that stood there of hard, smooth stone. Then Tuor looked down upon the fair vale of Tumladen, set as a green jewel amid the encircling hills. The hidden valley of Tumladen, no cloud nor mist lay there, and looking down Luthien saw far below, as a white light starting from a green jewel, the radiance of Gondolin the fair. The trees across the water seemed closer and darker, being the eaves of Brethil forest. Coming at last to the crossings of Teiglin, she passed over, seeking the shelter of the great trees. Northward he looked, and descried the forest of Brethil, climbing green about Amun Obel in its midst, a high place in the forest. Now the river Teiglin ran in this manner. It flowed down from Ered Wethrin, swift as Narog, but at first between low shores, until after the crossings, gathering power from other streams, it clove away through the feet of the highlands upon which stood the forest of Brethil. Thereafter it ran in deep ravines, whose great sides were like walls of rock, but pent at the bottom the waters flowed with great force and noise. And there lay now one of these gorges, by no means the deepest, but the narrowest, just north of the inflow of Celebros. On the east side was a sheer cliff of some 40 feet, bare but tree-grown at the crown. On the other side was a bank somewhat less sheer and less high, shrouded with hanging trees and bushes, but between them the water ran fiercely among the rocks. Amun Rúth, the bald hill, whose bare head watched over many leagues of the wild. High above the stony heath it reared its crown, but its steep grey head was bare save for the red seragon that mantled the stone. The sun westering broke through the clouds and fell upon the crown, and the Seragon was all in flower. In the southwest of Doriath lay great pools and marshes. That region was named Eilean Uyal, the Twilight Meres, for they were wrapped in mists, and the enchantment of Doriath lay over them. But south of Eilean Uyal the land fell suddenly and steeply. Sirion fell from the north in a mighty fall, and then he plunged suddenly underground into great tunnels that the weight of his falling waters delved. And he issued again 3 leagues southward, with great noise and smoke through rocky arches at the foot of the hills, which were called the Gates of Sirion. This dividing fall was named Andram, the Long Wall, from Nargothrond to Ramdal, the wall's end in East Beleriand. Between Ramdal and Gelion there stood a single hill of great extent and gentle slopes, but seeming mightier than it was, for it stood alone, and that hill was named Amon Ereb. Between Sirion and Gelion was a wild land of tangled forest in which no folk went. Taurim Duinath it was named, the forest between the rivers. The guarded woods of Doriath, its northern and lesser part, the forest of Neldoreth, was bounded east and south by the dark river Esgalduin. To the beaches of Neldoreth I came in the autumn. Ah, the gold and the red and the sighing of leaves in the autumn in Taurnaneldor. And between Aros and Esgalduin lay the denser and greater woods of Region. Where the Esgalduin flowed down and parted Neldoreth from Region, there rose in the midst of the forest a rocky hill, and the river ran at its feet. There they made the gates of the Hall of Thingol, and they built a bridge of stone over the river, by which alone the gates could be entered. All Doriath lay east of Sirion, save for a narrow region of woodland between the meeting of Teiglin and Sirion and the Meres of Twilight. This wood was called Mithrim. Great oak trees grew there. The trees of Nan Elmoth were the tallest and darkest in all Beleriand, and there the sun never came. There was a pass exceeding steep upon the west, and that was the pass of Aglon, and a bitter wind blew ever through it from the north. But Celegorm and Curufin fortified Aglon and held it with great strength, and all the land of Himlad southward. The chief citadel of Maithros was upon the hill of Himring, the ever-cold, and that was wide-shouldered, bare of trees, and flat upon its summit, surrounded by many lesser hills. Between the arms of Gelion was the ward of Maglor, and here in one place the hills failed altogether. Therefore the Noldor held strength of cavalry in the plains at that place. Riders passed often over the vast northern plain, Lothlan the wide and empty. Mount Rerir stood out from the main range of Ered Lindon westward, and in the angle between Rerir and Ered Lindon there was a lake, shadowed by mountains on all sides save the south. That was Lake Helevorn, deep and dark, and beside it Caranthir had his abode. But all the great land between Gelion and the mountains, and between Rerir and the river Asgar, was called by the Noldor Thargelion. Ered Lómin, the Blue Mountains, between Eriador and the westernmost land of Middle-earth. The walls of the Blue Mountains. The mountains of Ered Lómin that he saw shining afar. The long slopes beneath Mount Dolomites. Crossing Gelion at Sarn Athrad, the ford of stones. Far to the east were the most ancient dwellings of the Naugrim, but they had delved for themselves great halls and mansions in the eastern side of Ered Lómin. To the north of the great height of Mount Dolomites was Belegost, and southward was delved Nogrod. Gelion was a great river. He flowed south for 40 leagues before he found his tributaries, and before he found the sea he was twice as long as Sirion, though less wide and full. From Ered Lómin flowed the 6 tributaries of Gelion. Asgar, Thalos, Legolin, Brilthor, Duilwen, and Adorant, swift and turbulent streams, falling steeply from the mountains, and between Asgar in the north and Adorant in the south, and between Gelion and Ered Lómin lay the far green country of Osiriand, the land of 7 rivers. I wandered in summer in the elm woods of Osiriand. Ah, the light and the music in the summer by the 7 rivers of Osir. Osiriand was a land cloven by 7 rivers, and that these fell steeply and very swift from the mountains of Ered Lómin. Beside one great waterfall, Dior had his house. Now at a point nearly midway in its course, the stream of Adorant divided and then joined again, and the island that its waters enclosed was named Tolgalen, the Green Isle. And they looked upon a world that was changed, for so great was the fury of those adversaries that the northern regions of the western world were rent asunder, and the sea roared in through many chasms, and there was confusion and great noise, and rivers perished or found new paths, and the valleys were upheaved, and the hills trod down, and Sirion was no more. In the great battle and the tumults of the fall of Thangorodrim there were mighty convulsions in the earth, and Beleriand was broken and laid waste, and northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the great sea. Tol Himling, Tol Fuin, and still Tol Morwen stands alone in the water beyond the new coasts that were made in the days of the wrath of the Valar.